Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this online presentation of our 2021 Fiscal Risks Report. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to take you through the highlights of the report, and then we'll go into an online question and answer session. My slides and speaking notes will be on the website at the end of the event. If you'd like to ask a question at any point, please use the Q&A feature, and Charlie and Andy and I will do our best to try and answer as many as possible. Please give your name and institution. Let me start by providing some background on this report, which differs in nature from our biannual forecasts. The OBR was first tasked with producing a fiscal risks report in 2015 as part of the government's efforts to improve the surveillance of potential threats to its fiscal plans in the aftermath of the financial crisis. A few other countries, including the Netherlands and Finland, produced similar reports, but the UK is unique in outsourcing its production to an independent body as a means of ensuring objectivity and transparency in the identification and evaluation of risks. Our first two biennial FRRs in 2017 and 2019 took an encyclopedic approach to cataloging the universe of potential threats to the public finances. Between them, they identified 97 different fiscal risks, ranging from nuclear decommissioning to a no-deal Brexit. But since our last report, the UK and the world have experienced the largest peacetime economic and fiscal shock in over 3 centuries. Like most, but admittedly not all economists, we didn't see coronavirus coming. A global pandemic was not on our list of 97 risks. That said, the stress test included in our 2017 report did presage the roughly 30% of GDP rise in government debt resulting from the pandemic, albeit as a result of a different combination of shocks. This underscores the value and importance of exploring the implications of major shocks to the public finances, even if their precise nature, timing, and magnitude is uncertain. With that goal in mind, this edition of the FRR departs from the encyclopedic approach of the past and focuses instead on 3 large and potentially catastrophic sources of fiscal risk. The first is coronavirus itself, and Chapter 2 of the report looks back at the fiscal impact of the pandemic in historical and international context. It also considers the potential legacy of the pandemic for the public finances over the medium and long term, and it concludes by drawing a set of lessons from the pandemic for how forecasters and policymakers should approach other potentially catastrophic fiscal risks. Chapter 3 looks ahead to the fiscal risks posed by climate change and the economic and fiscal implications of alternative paths to meeting the government's legislated goal of reducing net greenhouse gas emissions to 0 by 2050. And with the pandemic having pushed the UK's government debt above 100% of GDP for the first time since the 1960s, Chapter 4 considers the fiscal risks presented by a change in the cost of that debt by exploring alternative scenarios for the future path of interest rates, inflation, and growth. But because the other 97 risks identified in previous FRRs have not gone away just because one major risk has crystallized, Chapter 5 of the report provides an update on how these other risks have fared over the past 2 years. And while all the analysis and conclusions we present here are our own, in preparing this report, we've benefited enormously from the advice and support of officials in the Treasury, Bank of England, other government departments, the Climate Change Committee, and experts across a range of universities and think tanks. And none of this would have been possible without the tireless efforts of OBR staff, for which Andy, Charlie, and I are enormously grateful, particularly at the end of such a demanding 16 months. But having faced 2 once-in-a-century economic shocks in just over a decade, in the form of the 2008 financial crisis and the 2020 coronavirus pandemic, we start out by asking the more general question of whether the world is becoming a riskier place for those managing the public finances. And while the arrival of 2 major economic shocks in quick succession does not necessarily constitute a trend, there are several reasons to believe that advanced economies are increasingly exposed to large and potentially catastrophic risks. First, while the threat of armed conflict appears to have diminished in the first part of this century, at least in comparison with the beginning of the last one, the past 20 years has seen an increase in the frequency and severity of major risk events, such as episodes of extreme weather and outbreaks of infectious diseases. This appears to reflect a combination of an increase in man-made risks, such as climate change and cyber attacks, coupled with growing numbers of people living closer to the sources of natural risks, such as floodplains and isolated ecosystems, and deepening global interconnectedness, which allows risk factors, be they biological or computer viruses, to be quickly transmitted between countries. As countries' exposure to catastrophic risk increases, so do the associated risks to their public finances. This is because such risks are not only more disruptive to the economies that generate governments' revenues, but also because they're more likely to overwhelm private insurance mechanisms, forcing governments to step in as insurer of last resort. As can be seen from this chart on the evolution of UK government debt since the turn of the century, the triggering of this insurer of last resort function can have dramatic and lasting consequences for the government's finances. Indeed, of the 80% of GDP increase in public debt since the turn of the century, 2/3 of that rise occurred in just 4 years, at the height of the financial crisis in 2008-9 and the coronavirus pandemic in 2020-21. So it's no exaggeration to say that any understanding of the fiscal history of the 21st century needs to start from an understanding of major crises and their consequences for the public finances. With that in mind, let me turn to our evaluation of the economic and fiscal legacy of the coronavirus pandemic. The pandemic brought about the largest and most synchronized peacetime shock to the world economy, and that it's faced since the Great Depression in the 1930s. While few countries escaped its economic consequences, the UK was harder hit than most, suffering the second deepest recession among advanced economies after Spain. The relative severity of the downturn in the UK is likely a consequence of several factors, including first, the fact that the UK was relatively hard hit by the virus itself, suffering some of the highest rates of infections, hospitalizations, and deaths in 2020. Second, and related, the UK spent more time under stricter public health restrictions than most other advanced economies last year. And third, the UK was more economically vulnerable to the pandemic due to the relatively large share of social consumption in our output. Reflecting this outsized impact on the UK economy, the pandemic also imparted an extraordinary shock to the UK's public finances, with borrowing reaching a peacetime high of around 15% of GDP in 2021, the second highest deficit amongst 35 advanced economies. Unlike during the financial crisis, whose fiscal impact was concentrated on the receipt side of the budget, the vast bulk of the increase in borrowing during the pandemic was due to discretionary increases in government spending. The UK government's coronavirus rescue package was the second largest in the G7 after the US, and it was heavily skewed towards spending on healthcare, compared with rescue packages in other countries. As you can see from the green blocks on this chart, we spent 3 times more on support to the health sector during the pandemic than the average advanced economy. The relatively large scale of the UK's fiscal policy response to the pandemic is also likely to be a consequence of a number of factors, including first, the UK economy and health services being relatively hard hit by the pandemic itself, requiring a more fulsome fiscal response. Second, as shown on this slide, the UK entered the pandemic with relatively little spare capacity in the health service, with fewer acute and intensive care beds per capita than the average OECD country. So more capacity had to be brought in to cope with the demands of the pandemic. And third, the UK's pre-pandemic system of working age welfare offered relatively low income replacement rates for those falling out of work. This meant that a more generous temporary income insurance system in the form of the furlough scheme had to be rapidly bolted on to the existing universal credit regime to prevent many households suffering large falls in income while temporarily away from work. A relatively rapid economic recovery, coupled with the withdrawal of this pandemic-related fiscal support, is expected to generate a sharp fall in borrowing over the next few years and enable the Chancellor to meet his objective of balancing the current budget and getting debt falling by the middle of this decade. But there are significant risks to the government's medium-term fiscal plans from the legacy of unfunded pressures that the pandemic may leave behind for public services. Governments always enter spending reviews with pressures that exceed the amounts that the Treasury wishes to allocate. But going into the next spending review this autumn, these pressures look particularly challenging. We estimate that the government could face around £10 billion a year in pandemic legacy pressures in just 3 areas. These include £7 billion of unfunded pressure on the NHS, from the need to pay for a standing test and trace and revaccination programs, the consequences of the pandemic for individuals' physical and mental health, additional spare capacity to cope with possible future infectious disease outbreaks, and to deal with the backlog of 3.5 million elective treatments built up during the pandemic. They also include around £1 billion a year for catch-up schooling for pupils who've missed out on between 2 and 3 months of education during the pandemic, and another £2 billion a year to fill the holes in the fare boxes of the railways and Transport for London, left by the collapse in passenger numbers over the past 18 months, which remained 50% below their pre-pandemic levels. And this is by no means an exhaustive list. There are pandemic backlogs in the courts too, and that's before looking at the cost of returning overseas development spending to 0.7% of national income or reforming adult social care. Choices made at the spending review in the budget will determine the extent to which these pressures are absorbed, or whether they end up hitting borrowing, taxes, or other spending programs. But perhaps more important for the long-term sustainability of the public finances than these legacy pressures on public services is the lasting impact of the pandemic on the economy. Our last two forecasts included a range of scenarios for the long-run economic consequences of the pandemic. These range from an upside scenario in which potential GDP returns to its pre-pandemic path, and a downside scenario in which 6% of output is permanently lost as a result of coronavirus. Our central forecast assumes 3% scouring of potential output, which puts us fairly close to the consensus of independent forecasts for GDP in the medium term, even if our most recent forecasts appear to have been too pessimistic about the initial post-lockdown rebound in output in the first part of this year. Evidence to date on the potential degree of long-run scouring has been mixed. There's been some upside news on the path of both GDP and investment, but against that, there's been downside news on net outward migration over the past year. And this month saw the beginning of the withdrawal of government support through the furlough scheme, although it will not be fully closed until the end of September. And while the numbers on furlough have fallen from a peak of around 9 million in April of last year, over 2.5 million people, or around 9% of payroll employees, were still receiving government support in May of this year. We'll be reviewing our judgment about the long-run supply consequences of the pandemic in our forecast for the autumn budget once government support is fully withdrawn, and we have a clearer picture of the underlying strength of the post-pandemic economy. Having reviewed how the UK economy and public finances weathered the coronavirus pandemic in Chapter 2, Chapter 3 looks ahead to the challenges, choices, and trade-offs involved in dealing with another major global threat, that of climate change. As fiscal risks, pandemic and climate change share several characteristics in common. There's a high degree of uncertainty about their timing and associated costs. They're characterized by tipping points, beyond which those costs can begin to escalate dramatically. They require a society-wide effort to resolve within a given country. But they're also both global in nature and beyond the capacity of any single country to solve unilaterally. Humanity has already emitted enough greenhouse gases into the atmosphere to take global temperatures to 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels. On existing policies, we're on track for temperature rises of up to 3 degrees, or even more if irreversible tipping points are crossed. To keep the increasing global temperatures to the 1.5 to 2 degree limit set in Paris 6 years ago, global CO2 emissions need to be reduced to zero by the middle of this century, a goal that's increasingly being embodied in national targets and laws around the world, including here in the UK. And while the UK amounts for an admittedly small, just 1% of global greenhouse emissions, we've made relatively significant progress in reducing our own carbon footprint, cutting carbon emissions by 44% since 1990, more than any other G7 country. However, the phasing out of coal-fired power plants accounted for more than half of this reduction in emissions over the past 30 years. And getting the rest of the way to the government's legislated target of net zero emissions by 2050 will require a much broader effort to decarbonize the rest of power generation, as well as transport, industry, and domestic and commercial heating. To understand the economic implications of this transition, we've drawn on the scenarios prepared by the Climate Change Committee for the whole economy cost of reaching net zero by 2050, and separate Bank of England scenarios for the path of total output consistent with that goal. In some sectors of the economy, such as transport shown here in green, decarbonization pays for itself as improvements in battery technology drive the lifetime cost of electric vehicles below that of petrol-driven cars. But in other areas, such as the replacement of household gas boilers with zero carbon alternatives, shown here in the yellow bars, there are significant net costs which society will need to bear if it is to successfully decarbonize. The fiscal implications of making this transition to net zero partly depend on which of these costs the state chooses to take on. In our report, we assume that the government picks up about a quarter of the whole economy cost of the transition, including about 45% of the cost of decarbonizing buildings, which make up the bulk of the gross cost of the public sector of around £350 billion over 30 years, which is about 0.4% of GDP a year, if we start now. However, the net cost of the transition to net zero depends on what happens on the revenue side of the ledger. And climate change presents both threats and opportunities to government receipts. At risk are the 1.5% of GDP worth of revenue that the government currently collects in fuel duty and vehicle excise duty, shown here in green. With the sale of petrol-driven cars banned from 2030, these revenues are almost certain to disappear as people shift to driving electric vehicles that don't pay these taxes. The key revenue opportunity presented by climate change is the opportunity to tax carbon emissions more heavily as a means of encouraging the adoption of zero carbon technologies. As shown in the yellow bars, this has the potential to raise a roughly equivalent amount of revenue, but on a declining profile as the economy decarbonizes. But the front-loaded profile of net carbon revenues could help the government to defray some of the upfront costs shown on the previous slide. Putting both direct investment costs and revenue impacts together with the indirect effects of decarbonization on the economy, we arrive at an overall profile for the net fiscal cost of getting to net zero emissions by 2050. Based on a scenario in which the UK ramps up both carbon taxes and investment from the mid-2020s, making the transition to net zero by 2050 adds about 20% of GDP to government debt over the next 30 years, slightly less than the pandemic is expected to add in just 2. The bulk of that cost comes from the loss of fuel duty as a source of revenue, shown in yellow, followed by government support for investments in zero carbon technologies, shown in red. These costs are only partly offset by the additional revenues that come from taxing carbon more heavily, shown here in blue. But of course, this is only one scenario for reaching net zero, and arguably quite an optimistic one, in which governments around the world act decisively in this decade to put their emissions on a steeply declining trajectory. We therefore model a range of alternative scenarios reflecting different choices about the timing of the transition, its impact on the productivity of the economy, and the fiscal policy choices made along the way. On the extreme left, we can see that there is one scenario in which the transition to net zero can actually save the government money if investment costs are funded within, rather than on top of, existing spending plans, and declining revenues from fuel duty are replaced by another tax on motoring, such as a road user charge. On the extreme right is a scenario in which the government delays taking action until the 2030s and has to manage a more hurried and costly transition to net zero and misses out on 5 years of carbon tax revenues. The price of this delay is a doubling of the total fiscal cost of the transition. In between, we illustrate the fiscal implications of alternative assumptions about the impact of decarbonization on the underlying productivity of the UK economy. And of course, the cost of any of these scenarios for reaching net zero pale in comparison with the fiscal consequences of unmitigated climate change, which in the absence of offsetting fiscal action, could push government debt well above 200% of GDP by the end of the century. Having considered 2 major fiscal risks, one of which has and one of which could add 20% of GDP to the government stock of debt, our 4th chapter looks at what might happen to the cost of that debt. Government debt is both a product of fiscal risks that have crystallized in the past and a source of fiscal risks that could crystallize in the future. And the threat that it poses to the fiscal outlook depends crucially on the future path of interest rates. Over the past 4 decades, the amount that the government spends every year to service its debt has fallen 4-fold, from 3.8% of GDP in 1980 to 0.9% of GDP in 2020, despite the debt to GDP ratio more than doubling, from 40 to 100% of GDP in that time. This reflects the downward drift in global interest rates to historically low levels, both in absolute terms and relative to the growth in GDP. Whether the government's current stock of debt is sustainable in the long run depends on the extent to which the factors that have driven borrowing costs to these historic lows over the past 30 years are likely to keep them low over the next 30. As this slide shows, explanations for the decline in real interest rates have varied and include a mix of long-run trends like demographic change, combined with possibly more temporary factors like a slowdown in global productivity growth. And there's sufficient reason to believe that at least some of these trends could be reversed to justify a detailed exploration of their fiscal implications. And independent of when or how much global interest rates might change in the coming years, 3 developments over the past 2 decades have made the UK public finances more sensitive to any changes in borrowing costs. First and foremost, debt is 3 times higher than it was in 2000. So, all else equal, a given change in the cost of debt will have 3 times the impact on public spending now than it did 20 years ago. Second is the growing share of UK gilts in foreign hands, which has risen from around 10% in the late 1980s to almost 30% today. This growing reliance on foreign buyers renders the UK government more susceptible to sudden changes in sentiment on the part of these investors who, unlike domestic pension funds, are under no regulatory obligation to invest in sterling assets to match their sterling liabilities. A third factor that's increased the sensitivity of UK public debt to future interest rate changes has been the maturity transformation wrought by the Bank of England's quantitative easing operations. By swapping relatively high interest but long-dated gilts for low interest but shorter maturity central bank reserves, the net result of these operations has been to reduce the median maturity of the consolidated liabilities of the public sector from 7 years to just 2 since QE began in 2008, as shown in the red line in the chart on the left-hand side. The consequence for the public finances is that twice as much of the cost of any increase in interest rates would be felt in the first year rather than being spread out over time, as shown in the dark green bars on the right. Indeed, with debt 3 times higher and twice as much of any interest rate rise being felt in the first year, a 1% rise in interest rates would now raise government debt servicing costs by 0.5% in GDP in the first year, compared to less than 0.1% of GDP in the early 2000s. The consequence of this heightened sensitivity of the government debt stock to changes in borrowing costs are illustrated in the second part of Chapter 4, which looks at alternative paths for key macroeconomic variables, including interest rates, inflation, and growth. And what's striking about these scenarios is the difficulty of reducing the debt burden via changes to any of these variables. In the 21st century, the government would struggle to either grow or inflate away its stock of debt, because any permanent changes in these variables is quickly reflected in the interest paid on most of its existing stock of liabilities. And shorter debt maturities also render the public finances more vulnerable to more extreme scenarios, such as a loss of investor confidence, in which rising interest rates and debt feed each other in a self-reinforcing spiral, which pushes debt servicing costs to prohibitive levels. Finally, while this report focuses on 3 large and looming threats to the public finances, the array of other fiscal risks highlighted in previous FRRs have not evaporated in the meantime. So the final chapter of our report provides an update on this long list of other risks. And what this update demonstrates is that when it comes to fiscal risks, when it rains, it pours, with the coronavirus shock triggering a cascade of other risks, including the pensions triple lock, the rescue private train operators, and an outflow of EU migrants. Indeed, of the 97 fiscal risks previously identified, 38 have somehow been affected by the pandemic, including 70% of those that have crystallized and 80% of those that have increased since 2019. However, one area that's proved remarkably resilient in the face of the coronavirus shock has been the financial sector. This likely reflects both the fact that the banking sector entered the pandemic much better capitalized than in 2008, and the fact that the government stepped in aggressively to underwrite the supply of credit, with £75 billion worth of loan guarantees and other financial support. So what are the lessons we can draw from this analysis for how we forecast and manage the public finances in what appears to be an increasingly risky world? The report identifies 10 lessons, but I'll just highlight the following 5. First, catastrophic risks are real and may have become more frequent. Just 2 decades into this century, advanced economies have now experienced 2 once-in-a-century economic shocks. And increasing economic and financial interconnectedness may make future shocks both more frequent and more severe. Second, while it's difficult to predict when they will materialize, it is possible to anticipate their effects. Pre-pandemic modeling by institutions like the US Congressional Budget Office and the World Bank provided a clear indication of how economies might be affected by a global pandemic, even if such work attracted little attention from policymakers. So forecasters like ourselves need to place greater emphasis on analyzing potentially catastrophic risks, like climate change and sovereign debt crises, as well as communicating their consequences to policymakers and the public. Third, there are advantages to preventing or halting processes that involve rapidly escalating costs. Pandemics, climate change, and public debt dynamics are all subject to feedback mechanisms and tipping points that put a premium on acting early. We saw over the last 18 months how countries that acted quickly to contain the domestic spread of coronavirus experienced fewer deaths, shallower recessions, and earlier economic recoveries. And our modeling of the dynamics of climate change suggests that early decisive actions to tackle carbon emissions could halve the overall fiscal cost of getting to net zero. Fourth, when investing in risk prevention, governments tend to fight the last war. The tightening of financial regulations after 2008 helped prevent the pandemic from triggering another financial crisis. But post-crisis fiscal consolidation also cut advanced country expenditure on preventative health programs. And dealing with the post-pandemic fiscal pressures may hamper governments' efforts to invest the relatively modest sums needed to avoid the much greater cost of unmitigated climate change. And fifth and finally, in the absence of perfect foresight, fiscal space may be the single most valuable risk management tool. Throughout its history, the UK has relied on its ability to borrow large sums quickly to respond to major economic and security threats. Faced with an array of major economic and fiscal risks, policymakers must trade off making significant investments in the prevention of specific fiscal risks while preserving sufficient fiscal space to respond to those risks that they did not anticipate or could not prevent. And with that as a parting thought, I'll conclude my presentation, and Charlie, Andy, and I will look forward to your questions. And it looks like we've got a A first question from Kate of the Sun, a question on climate change. Have you forecast how much a household will have to pay to hit these net zero targets? How many thousands of pounds the average Brit will have to pay to upgrade a boiler, switch to electric cars, etc.? Will the poorest be hit hardest? Andy, do you want to take that question?
Sure. So we haven't forecast that. Those are policy questions for the government. But in the absence of any policy specifics in this area at the moment, we have had to make some assumptions to make our scenarios work. So we start with figures from the Climate Change Committee, which look at the additional cost over and above what would happen in a fossil fuel world. So if you think of replacing boilers, that means we are looking at the additional cost of a heat pump relative to the cost of a gas boiler. For things like electric cars, it very quickly becomes cheaper to buy an electric car than a fossil fuel alternative. So the cost there moves to zero. But for domestic heating, which is one of the bigger costs, we have put in a stylized assumption, if you will, that the poorest households, the costs are covered by government, the richest households, they're not, and in the middle is in the middle, which gets to an assumption that half of the costs are borne by the government. But that is just a modelling assumption in the absence of specific government policies.
And there's a follow-up question, which is, you say that the cost of hitting a net zero pale in comparison to unmitigated climate change. Can you explain this, and what is the cost comparison between the two?
Sure. So the cost of unmitigated climate change is, rather than being the cost of subsidizing zero carbon boilers, for example, it's the costs that accrue through the damage done to the economy. And so we're really talking there about extreme weather events in the UK, but also spillovers from even worse outcomes in hotter countries. So be it climate-driven war or migration that really destabilizes the economy. So we've just again, in a stylized way, looked at a world in which higher temperatures lead to more frequent and more costly economic and fiscal shocks, pushing debt much higher. So the benefit of avoiding that is very great.
Thanks, Andy. The next question is about fiscal space, and a two-parter. Can you assess how much fiscal space we have, and are you saying that UK now doesn't have any? I might ask Charlie to come in a second on this question, but maybe just by way of preamble, we're not saying the UK doesn't have any fiscal space. It was evident from the pandemic that most advanced countries had significant fiscal space in order to respond to that pandemic. In the UK, we borrowed around 15–16% of GDP in 1 year. That's more than we've ever borrowed in peacetime. And we did so at historically low interest rates. So that suggests that governments do have access to a lot of finance in a big hurry when they need it. But there are a number of factors which determine fiscal space, not just the overall level of debt. I wonder if Charlie wanted to come in on what factors might determine the amount of fiscal space available to government.
Yes, one of the things that the report emphasizes is the endogenous nature of fiscal space. If you go back 10 years or so to the time of the financial crisis, when governments were moving towards austerity, there was a bit of a feeling that there was some magic number that constituted an upper bound to the level of government debt that countries should carry. I think the debate has moved on from there to recognize that how much fiscal space there is affected by a lot of things, which include not only how much debt you have at the time. Clearly, if you have higher debt, that's going to imply less space. But also the key thing is how much you can borrow before you run into problems actually acquiring the finance. The confidence of investors in the credibility of the macroeconomic policy framework, those sorts of issues become important. And the amount of fiscal space you have may well depend upon the nature of the shock. So, for instance, when you have a global shock, like the financial crisis and to some extent the pandemic as well, typically you see those high quality governments, the high quality debt being viewed as a safe haven. So the fiscal space expands endogenously. Whereas if a country is subject to an idiosyncratic shock or something specific happening to that country, which loses the confidence of investors, then that fiscal space may contract quite sharply. And the scenario that we explore at the end of the debt chapter is essentially one where you can think of it as being a particular shock that hits the UK that has a serious effect on the supply side of the economy, and results in a market narrowing in fiscal space. And in terms of the question, are you saying that the UK doesn't have any now? We would certainly say not. Sorry, let me clarify. I'm not saying that we haven't got any space, but quite the opposite. The UK has been able to borrow quite happily. But it is important to ensure that you maintain that fiscal space to deal with any future shocks that may come along.
Thanks, Charlie. And next, a related question from Richard Partington at The Guardian, which is, can I ask for your view on whether there is a bigger risk to the public finances from failure to rebuild fiscal space to cope with the scenario of rising debt service costs, or the failure to increase total spending to address legacy pandemic costs and pre-pandemic pressures? I think this kind of goes to the heart of the fiscal policy making dilemma in a risky world, and I feel we don't have any easy answers, and I don't think there really are any. I think chancellors have to walk and chew gum at the same time. They have to keep some firepower in reserve to deal with risks that they haven't anticipated, but also deal with the known pressures that come out of previous crises, as well as try and look ahead and act to prevent what they know are risks and crises that could happen in the future. And one of those that we draw attention to in the report is climate change, which is what Niall Ferguson would refer to as a sort of grey rhino type risk, which is something which is coming at you slowly, but you know that if you don't do anything about it, could have disastrous consequences. And it is an area where the work that we've done suggests that acting early does make it cheaper in the long run to actually deal with, because there are both fiscal advantages from the point of view of being able to tax carbon early, as well as spending advantages from being able to spread out the cost of doing things like replacing household gas boilers over a period of time, and doing it more efficiently. I don't know if my colleagues wanted to comment on any of those points. No. In that case, we'll move on to Ben Zaranko, where he says, your analysis of pressures on departmental spending doesn't seem to consider pressures for increased public sector pay awards, particularly in the NHS. We didn't consider that, and I think it is partly because pay is a decision that is in the gift of the government and something which gets decided every year. We tried to focus on what we see as being the most difficult to resist volume pressures coming at the health service from the outside, and those coming from a backlog in procedures that didn't happen in 2020, which may need to happen in the coming years, as well as the kind of pressures that come from the health consequences of the pandemic itself, be they the impact on people's mental or on their physical health. So there wasn't a specific calculation made in there about pay awards. I think, but the one thing which the government does have to be conscious of is what is the medium to long term outlook for inflation, which will obviously have implications for how those pay awards are set. Okay, and then we've got Phil Aldrich. You said that in the 21st century, the government will struggle to either grow or inflate away debt. What options does that leave? Well, it leaves one option, which is running larger primary surpluses, which is the way that governments used to reduce their debt stocks in the past when inflation was low. and when they had much more open capital markets. And so in the end, the Chancellor is faced with a much tougher set of choices, which are really about tax and spending if you want to get debt down, rather than, as it were, some of the tricks that previous chancellors have been able to use in previous circumstances when you had a longer average maturity of debt, which meant that the impact of higher inflation eroded more of the debt stock than it did today, because debt maturities were much longer. And also when capital markets were much more closed. And so government had the option really of setting economy-wide interest rates themselves, rather than allowing markets to respond to what happens to things like inflation prospects more or less overnight, and seeing those reflected in interest rates. Russell Lynch at The Telegraph, you said your forecasts are a little pessimistic. Have you modeled your risks with little or no scarring? Also, your assumptions about the return to peak by mid-2022 now looks way off. So this is a question about how the economic outlook is comparing to the forecast that we made back in our March economic and fiscal outlook. I wonder if, Charlie, you wanted to offer a few thoughts on what the latest data looks like compared to our forecast.
Well, certainly the activity data has surprised to the upside. Some of that is just a measurement issue to do with the way public sector output is measured, but there's also something more substantial in terms of the strength of the rebound in private consumption and so forth. I would caution, though, from reading directly across from that to what it implies about the impact in the medium term and the extent of scarring, where actually we haven't really learned all that much yet. There is some upside news on that front insofar as investment looks to have been a bit stronger over the past than we thought. But against that, it looks like there's been significant outflows of migrants and fewer migrants coming in who would otherwise have done in the absence of the pandemic. And as of the current juncture, we still don't know how many of the, well, about 2.5 million people on furlough in May, maybe it's down to about 2 million now. How many of those are going to stay in jobs as the furlough scheme rolls off, and how many will flow into unemployment? And we have seen, of course, vacancies at quite high levels in some sectors like hospitality, suggesting the labour market is quite tight in some parts. And then finally, there's the question of how many bankruptcies we'll see. It has been remarkable how low bankruptcies have been during the pandemic, markedly beneath the levels that you would normally expect in the economy. And that partly reflects the fact that very generous support levels from the government have probably kept some non-viable jobs going. So there's quite a lot of uncertainty which will be gradually resolved as we go through the second half of this year and into the beginning of next year. And it will become somewhat clearer what longer term impact the pandemic has had on the economy's supply potential.
Thanks, Charlie. So a question from Faisal Islam from the BBC. Are you saying that the triple lock will be triggered more than expected over the medium term, as well as the anomaly this year? Well, because of the way the triple lock operates, the more volatility there is in the macroeconomy, the more expensive it's likely to be, because one of the three components is more likely to dominate the others and have a high reading at a given point in time. At the moment, it looks as though there's going to be very strong earnings growth this year. That is because earnings growth was so artificially low last year. So earnings are rebounding from a lower level. And because the triple lock has no memory about what happened in the past, it's not as though this is sort of making up for lost ground last year. Other elements of the triple lock will have been triggered in the past for the operating of pensions. So I think the shorter answer is if the future proves as volatile as the present, then the triple lock does prove to be more expensive over the medium term than just a simple forecast of either earnings or inflation or 2.5% over time. I don't know whether colleagues wanted to add anything to that on the triple lock. No? So moving on to David Robinson, the fiscal risks report section on debt interest costs appears to assume that increases in bank rate will be the sole tool used to tackle higher inflation. Is it possible to think that interest costs could be markedly lower if the debt stock was lowered by quantitative tightening, or if changes were made to central bank reserve remuneration, as Charles Goodhart suggests? Charlie, this sounds like a question for you.
Certainly does. You're correct that we focus on the implications of different paths in short-term rates, bank rate in particular, although there is some discussion about the consequences if instead the bank took the decision to shrink the size of the APF. The important thing to point out here is that if there is quantitative tightening, that will put upward pressure on longer term interest rates, so that there's no free lunch in that regard. The other thing, you raised the question about whether you could make changes to the way reserves are remunerated, as the way Charles Goodhart suggested. There is actually a box in the report which touches on these and some other approaches that people have suggested to reduce the cost of reserves when bank rate is higher. The thing to remember there is certainly if you were simply going to pay no interest on reserves, but require banks to hold those reserves, it would essentially be acting as a tax on the banking sector. And other approaches that have been suggested also have similar issues. Now, that's not to say you may not choose to go down those roads, but they're not straightforward solutions to this problem.
Thanks, Charlie. I think next a question on the climate change chapter, which I'll pass to Andy, which is, why have you assumed that taxpayers shoulder 1/4 of the total economic cost of the transition to net zero? Is that the direction of policy as you see it, or a global standard? Andy, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So I wouldn't describe it as either a prediction of the direction of policy or a global standard. What we've tried to do in the report, in the absence of government policy setting out what the government thinks the state should bear, is to look at each of the major sources of cost of getting to net zero, and to think about the reasons why it might be challenging if left to the private sector alone, and to make assumptions from there. So for things like power generation, essentially none of the costs are assumed to be borne by the state. There's already a system in place whereby they're borne by customers. The big sector and the big cost that we've had to make an assumption about is, as I say, domestic heating, where the investment costs, the upfront costs of switching to low carbon technologies are quite high, which means there's a lot of inertia to overcome, and that looks like an area where government costs could be higher. So the sum of all the assumptions across the different sectors gets you to the 1/4 figure, but other figures are possible.
Thanks, Andy. A question from Jack Barnett, City AM. Given you're forecasting a significant long-term hit to GDP due to COVID, and that the debt to GDP ratio has already reached its highest level since the 1960s, do you think businesses will face higher taxes in the future as the government looks to raise revenue? I think the short answer to that question is that businesses are already facing higher taxes in future that were announced in the last budget. The corporation tax is already going from the rate is already going from 19 to 25%. And that actually takes the tax burden on the corporate sector to its highest level since the middle of the last century. And that is because not only is the rate significantly higher, but actually the government's taken a lot of actions to close loopholes in the corporate tax base through things like ring fencing and group relief, which means that a rate of corporation tax which looks relatively mid-table by OECD standards actually entails a much higher tax take from the sector as a whole, because it's being levied on a much wider base. So taxes on businesses are already going up in the government's fiscal plans, and the bite on corporate profits is more than we've seen in a very long time in this country. So to some extent, the government has already taken a decision on that question, which is to raise taxes on business. And they've also, of course, frozen the high rate threshold and personal allowance, which increases personal taxes. So we've already seen some choices being made on tax. We highlight in the report also some risks and pressures on the spending side. Whether they lead to sort of further action on the tax side or whether the government chooses to offset them in other ways, we'll have to see in the forthcoming spending review and in the forthcoming budget. We have a question from Holly Williams from PA. What's your outlook for UK inflation? What is your forecast for CPI in 2021? And how much of a risk is this for the country's finances and for the UK's household finances? Charlie, do you want to do that one on inflation?
Yes, our last forecast for inflation, central forecast, we produced obviously earlier on this year in our spring economic and fiscal outlook, which had inflation rising in the short run, partly as a result of base effects, and then dropping back towards the 2% target in the medium term. Obviously, there's quite a lot of chatter at the moment about, are we on the cusp of a resurgence in inflation? I think there I would stress that this is much more of an issue in the United States, where you have aggressively expansionary fiscal policies coupled with a monetary policy stance, which is very deliberately accommodative. But it's appropriate to ask the question here. As I mentioned earlier, we're starting to see some bottlenecks appearing in particular sectors of the labour market. There's some supply issues in some parts of the economy, and that might add to inflationary pressures. I think the answer is we don't really know whether this is purely temporary, as is certainly the majority view on the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee, or whether there might be a little bit more underlying strength in domestically generated inflation, which might require a countervailing policy action. It is one of the reasons why the first of our inflation scenarios in the debt chapter is essentially a temporary inflation shock, where inflation rises to 5%. The bank has to raise bank rate to bring inflation back under control. That has an effect on the public finances, a chunk of which simply comes from the fact that in the short run, much of government spending is fixed in cash terms, so its real value declines. But when you look out into the medium term, it's a pretty small effect, and that reflects the combination of the factors that Richard mentioned in his opening remarks, that both the the mean maturity of public liabilities is really quite short. The median maturity of public liabilities is quite short, around about 2 years. So you get about 50% of an interest rate hike coming through onto debt interest in a little over a year, coupled with the fact that the UK has a relatively high fraction of index-linked bonds. So inflation is not a very effective way to reduce the public debt burden. We also explore a permanently higher inflation rate, and a key feature there is that it's likely to lead to a more than one-for-one rise in gilt rates because of an increase in the inflation risk premium. And that actually ends up working against you and worsening the public debt position.
Thanks, Charlie. A question from Isha Nelson. Do you expect the UK's pandemic legacy costs to differ dramatically to other countries? You already know that the fiscal response was the second highest after the US. Well, it was certainly the case that we had one of the largest fiscal policy responses amongst advanced economies, and the reasons that made the fiscal policy response during the pandemic quite high it also stands to reason that they might also mean that the legacy costs of the pandemic are greater. And that is because we spent a longer period in lockdown and with restrictions on economic activity, as well as restrictions on people's ability to access things like the health service and to access education. So the legacy costs that those leave behind in terms of backlog of patients that need to be treated, a backlog of students that need to catch up on schooling, means that there's more of that to be done over the medium term than there might have been in other countries where patients had regular access to hospitals throughout the pandemic, or students stayed in school for more of that period. So it stands to reason that there is more catching up to do in countries like the UK, which spent a relatively long time under strict public health restrictions during the pandemic. But part of these costs also depend on what kind of behavior change we see coming out of the pandemic, in particular in sectors like transport. The big question about the transport sector is commuting ever going to return to the levels that you saw pre-pandemic? Passenger numbers are still down by about a half compared to what you saw pre-pandemic. Whether they return to the sorts of levels that you need to support the kind of financial framework we've had for the railways and the underground pre-pandemic is a big question. The National Infrastructure Commission have done a number of different scenarios, one which has passenger numbers returning to pre-pandemic levels, but another scenario where people spend a lot more time working from home, a lot more time staying in their local neighborhoods, which means that the commuters on which the UK transport system, both intercity as well as the commuting, as well as within cities, the commuter rail system, really depend. I mean, these are the main sources of fare revenues for transport. So some of it also depends on behavior change, and that is a big unknown. It depends on how all of us react to the removal of restrictions, and how our working, spending, and leisure patterns change as a result. We've got a question from Ben Clift. Have you moved away from thinking about the macroeconomy as being characterized by a fixed and stable rate of growth and supply around which shocks emanate? Does the normal times shocks dichotomy still operate or help? It's certainly the case that the idea that there is a sort of normal business cycle around which you have a stable evolution of supply, around which fluctuations in the economy are dictated by changes in aggregate demand. That has not been a particularly useful model for thinking about the UK economy, or indeed any advanced economy in the 21st century, because we faced in the UK actually three big shocks to supply. One was the financial crisis itself. The second was Brexit, which has changed our trading relationship with Europe. And the third was the pandemic, all of which have consequences not just for the way in which consumers spend their money, but actually in the way in which we organize output and supply, things like the supply of credit to the economy. So understanding shocks to both the supply and the demand side of the economy is really important to understanding how to react with policy, but also how to forecast economic developments. And this is perhaps most easily seen in the fact that when you look at our own estimates and forecasts for the output gap, so the gap between demand and supply in the economy, it was very small throughout the pandemic, because the pandemic was a hit to both supply and demand. People were out of work, people couldn't go to work, shops were closed, but people also weren't spending money because they didn't have the opportunities to do so. So we haven't seen very many. One thing, we haven't seen very many normal times in this since the start of this century. And the abnormal times that we've seen haven't been the sort of typical demand shocks that you saw in the last century. They've been things which affect both supply and demand for quite idiosyncratic reasons, be they a financial crisis and a drying up of credit, or a pandemic and the imposition of restrictions on businesses and on consumer behavior. Another question from Faisal Islam from BBC. Do you see the current high rates of growth as an arithmetic bounce back as the economy switches back on, or the start of a post-pandemic boom? Charlie, do you want to have a go at that one? I think behind that is also how consumers are using their household savings built up during the pandemic.
Indeed. Very largely, it's just an automatic bounce as you reopen the economy. And I do think it's dangerous if people simply extrapolate from recent rapid growth through into the rest of the year. You would expect the economy to exhibit very high growth rates if you shut large chunks of it down and then reopen them. That said, there is the question about whether there might be some extra strength on that, partly as a result of post-pandemic euphoria. And connected to this is the question of how the 200 billion or so of forced savings by some households during the pandemic, what will happen to them. Now, we take the view that most of those will continue to be held as savings, that they will be run down at a relatively modest rate, and that's exactly what standard economic theory would lead you to expect. So in our last EFO, about 25% of the extra savings was spent over the 5 years of the forecast period. Some of that might be a bit front-loaded, because during the pandemic there will have been reduced spending on durables, cars, things like that, and people make up for that when the shops reopen and so forth. There is the possibility that more than that will be spent. I think it's worth recognizing, though, that the people who've accumulated these savings are typically better off households. So, they've been prevented from taking holidays, going out to restaurants, things like that. There's a limit to how much you can blow on that. And also, one shouldn't forget that there's also some households, typically poorer households, who've actually been accumulating more debt during the pandemic, and that extra debt will weigh on their spending going forward. So generally speaking, our central view is that we would expect the rate of growth of the economy to moderate as we go on from here, that you certainly won't see the rapid growth rates that we've seen in the past as the regulations were relaxed, being repeated in the future.
Thanks, Charlie. I think maybe time for one more question from our colleague and friend Jagjit Chadha at NISA. The FRR is a cautious and thorough examination of risks, but do we see any risks that will reduce the debt burden, or are all risks on one side for governments? And relatedly, if the risks are overwhelmingly asymmetric, how much fiscal space do we need and how much do we have? So it is the case that our fiscal risks report makes particularly tough reading for chancellors, because we do focus on downside risks to the public finances rather than upside risks. And that reflects a few things. One is that governments don't seem to have any trouble spending upside risks or dealing with upside risks to the public finances when they materialize. They tend to often spend them. And so for that reason, they don't require as much attention from people who are trying to forecast the public finances, sort of draw potential threats to the attention of policymakers and the public. But it is also the case that in general, the risks the government faces are asymmetric and tilted toward the downside. When private companies face windfalls, they sometimes pay some of those profit windfalls over to government in the form of tax, but typically not all of them. But when the private sector face shocks and face losses, especially in the context of crises, those losses can end up being entirely socialized by governments as part of the need to rescue the economy. So government, by its very nature as insurer of last resort, is exposed to more downside risks than upside risks, because you have to remember the government's not charging the economy an insurance premium for that function. Society does ultimately end up paying for it by the fact that government incurs higher debt and has to pay interest on that debt. And if government's running up surpluses, it may be charging some taxes for that function. But in general, it is a function which exposes the public finances to downside risks, but the governments have realized fewer opportunities from upside risks than private sector actors might do. That's not to say that governments don't face upside risks. In the 1980s, the discovery of North Sea oil and gas was clearly a pleasant surprise for the governments then, and actually helped contribute to the reduction in debt over that period. Again, in the 2000s, the auctioning of what was then 3G mobile phone licenses delivered a significant windfall to the public finances, and again helped with reductions in debt levels. So happy surprises do come along once in a while for governments, but in general, risks tend to be tilted toward the downside, which is why you see this ratcheting up of the debt to GDP ratio every time we have a crisis, and then only gradually falling away as the economy normalizes. And I think I will probably call an end to it with that. Thank you very much indeed for all of your attention. Thanks to my colleagues Andy and Charlie for joining me this afternoon. And thank you very much indeed, in particular to colleagues in the OBR who have been working very hard on this report at the end of what has been a very tough year for them as well. So thank you very much to all of our colleagues at the OBR, and have a very good afternoon. Thank you.